And I also think day to day, we're immortals in our own mind. You can't really get through this life if you're thinking every moment that you're going to die, you
Hmm.
know? So we live as vampires. We live with the idea that we're immortal, that we have all the time in the world to find out everything.
I started writing this on the night that I heard that Anne Rice died because her death kind of shocked me in a way that was surprising. I really don't think I can remember any other celebrity death that hit me as hard. I wanted to sort out some thoughts and feelings on her books because how stunned I was hearing that she died made me start to think about how long her books have been a part of my life and how important they've been to me. When I was a kid, my mom was actually really very strict about what I read, but she was also a horror fan herself, and she had this bookshelf that was forbidden to me where she kept all of her horror novels, Stephen King and The Exorcist and so on, all that stuff. So, of course, out of all the books in our house, that was the one shelf from which I'd read every single book. I'd sneak them into my bedroom at night or when she wasn't home. I love Stephen King and all the rest, but Anne Rice was different. I still love Stephen King now, but all these years later, Anne Rice is the one from that shelf where I've still kept up with every single new thing that she's put out. Even when I was a little older and my mom would buy me horror books or let me buy horror books, there was still something that was kind of forbidden about Anne Rice. I remember being nervous to ask my mom for Queen of the Damned because I didn't think she'd like buying me a book with the word damned in the title. She was really sensitive about the religious stuff in Anne Rice. But more than the horror or the religion stuff, what really blew my mind about Anne Rice was the sex. As somebody who'd always had crushes on other boys basically since I was in kindergarten, I was never confused about that. But it simply was something that wasn't talked about. I wouldn't have had words to even explain it, even if I'd wanted to, probably until middle school or some point. Anne Rice, though, had no problems talking about sex, all kinds of sex. I love horror and vampires, and I'd read Bram Stoker's Dracula when I was really young, like I think third or fourth grade. And there was, of course, always a sexual subtext to all of that, and that might have even been what attracted me to it. But Anne Rice's vampires fucked. Or I guess technically they didn't fuck because in her mythology technically the vampires can't have sex, but the blood drinking was always clearly a metaphor for sex, and there was also lots of material about them before they turned into vampires, or material with them with humans who could have sex. Everything about it was sexual and erotic. Anne has said that she was fascinated with sadomasochism. Not only that, but most of the characters were beautiful men, and a lot of the times these beautiful men were fucking around with the other beautiful men. Being a kid back then, I didn't have the internet yet, so I couldn't go look up porn if I wanted. So all this stuff was giving actual detail to vague impulses that had been floating around in my head that I'd never known what exactly to do with. I don't want to seem to reduce her work just to porn or erotica, although she was great at writing that, and I don't think she was ashamed of it. But it was the mixture of the sex with the stories and the characters and the horror that made it also compelling. I thought it was even better that the characters usually weren't having or sometimes weren't even able to have standard normal sex. Everything was kinky and weird and dangerous. When I've read Anne's books over the past few years, I've thought many times that if they came out now, I bet they'd get canceled or cause some kind of moral outrage with the kids these days. Or at least they would if the cancel crowd trying to make everything safe and sanitized actually read books outside of the young adult section. Anne Rice's books are always sexy, but they're still firmly within the horror genre. So there's, frequent rape and incest and you name it. But the thing is that she's never really condoning or glorifying any of those kinds of things. She's just examining them. She liked to examine the darkest places that our hearts could take us. I liked that the sex in the book was fucked up sometimes and connected to the darkness because it meant that in the world of her books, nothing was taboo. It was immensely liberating because it was a free space for your imagination just to wander around without constant judgment. Growing up gay, of course, you're told or you infer that there's something wrong about your sexuality and that it's a bad thing. But in a universe where most of the characters were murderers, I mean, who was going to bat an eye over two guys going at it? That's kind of the least of the problems.
I've always thought the vampire was a powerful metaphor for the outsider in each of us, the predator in each of us, the outcast. I think there's a time in your life, in everybody's life, where a person confronts that he or she feels so different from other people, so alone, so alienated. The vampire is a perfect metaphor for all that. He looks like us, talks like us, and yet he's immortal. He's the undead, as you said, and he has to kill to live, and in a way we're all killing to live all the time.
So if you had to identify a group of people today as vampires, society's vampires, who would you say? Does anyone come to mind?
I would say any outsider, anybody who's ever experienced being despised, can identify to some extent with the vampire, because the vampire's always been this this creature that's cursed and told he's an abomination, but he's struggling desperately to live like everybody else, and sometimes he's more glamorous and more attractive and more seductive than people around him, but he's still living with that curse. And I think a lot of people go through that in life. There are a lot of groups, minorities that we target and despise and make things difficult for, and they often find vampire literature very fruitful and wonderful and inspiring.
Like who?
Well, certainly gay people identify a lot with vampire literature. The gay reviews of my work have been some of the most satisfying reviews I've ever read. Lestat's always wrestling with the question of God. He always is. And he's always wrestling with how can he live a meaningful life when the world sees him as a monster. He's a vampire. He's supposed to be an abomination. But he rebels against that because he didn't choose to be a vampire. And he doesn't know how to be good at being a vampire if this is something other people think is so awful. So he's always wrestling with these questions. How is he going to live his life? No, I let my imagination go everywhere. I mean, to me, the metaphor of the vampire is a very rich metaphor, and that is a great way to talk about God and the devil and good and evil and faith and loss of faith. I mean, I will go wherever my imagination takes me. I think exploring our humanity and exploring our imagination, they're one and the same. You know, and as a writer, that's my world. That's what I feel I can do, and maybe what I was born to do.
Daisy Darcy asks, if you had the chance to turn into a vampire, would you?
Yes, I would. I
Why?
couldn't resist
What's the
it.
appeal?
I couldn't resist being immortal. I don't want to die. I'm 75. I mean, of course I would do it. Yeah. I admire people who say they wouldn't. I'm not one of them. Yeah.
Christopher, first of all, I'm so sorry for your loss of your mother.
Thank you.
She really defies categorization, doesn't she, as a writer? I mean, they say she's the vampire writer, the Gothic stories writer, but I mean, you must be getting so many people responding to her work and her passing with their own views on what she contributed to their lives.
It's that she articulated this way of being different in the world. You know, my best friend Eric Shaw Quinn, who was also a very close friend of hers, said she brought an answer to this question that was particularly resonant to queer people of how can I be in this world and not be a thing of God? If God exists, then he created me, and that was what she used the vampire for, but it's also what she used witches for, and then later it was what she used werewolves for, which she used paranormal, supernatural, Gothic tales to pursue what she saw as these great cosmic spiritual questions.
Mm. As much as Anne liked to look at the dark side of human nature, the books were never about wallowing in it. I think ultimately everything she wrote was about a spiritual quest to understand our place in the universe, to transcend and to know something greater than ourselves. That's the seed that started out her whole vampire series, the idea of a vampire trying to understand why he was created and where he came from, and now that he had eternity, what to do with it. The whole thing started off as an extremely straightforward metaphor for the search for God. And above all else, her books were always concerned with beauty. By including the darkness of the world and with the quest for beauty, she made it a part of her whole vision of the world. She gave blood and violence beauty as part of a greater purpose and a complete, cohesive view of everything in the universe.
We share some kind of love of being able to define ourselves in terms of beauty and goodness, and not necessarily subscribing to anybody else's definition of what that is. It's a kind of a reaching for, how shall I put it, a reaching for the privilege of being ourselves, of being romantic in the way we want to be romantic, of demanding a kind of beauty for ourselves, no matter really what we look like or where we come from or how many people have told us that we're no good and we're going to go to hell. I don't see anything wrong with vampire fiction as moral fiction. I never have. again, I celebrate the imagination, and I celebrate a kind of embrace of the whole world, an embrace of this magnificent biological universe in which we have been born and of which we are witnesses. And I absolutely love being a writer and writing about it in all of these different ways, and I'm not afraid to go. I believe in going all the way with my explorations in these different matters. I feel pretty comfortable with it.
As gory or perverse as the books might get, she spent more time describing paintings or beautiful architecture that moved her than she did blood or anything terrible. She was in love with paintings and art in great cities. As a teenager, she gave me a new appreciation for Renaissance art and many, many other things. The heightened senses that she gave to her vampires were a way to allow us to see through their eyes and have greater appreciation for the world around us that we might otherwise take for granted. There's a scene in the book, The Vampire Lestat, that I always remember, where Lestat, who is hundreds of years old at this point, is marveling over things in the modern world that most of us might ignore or even think of as tacky. He can become mesmerized by a shampoo bottle or amazed at the way that common people are able to wear colorful clothing. That all would have been impossible centuries ago. Reading Anne's work gives you these new eyes to see the world around you, and it reminds you to appreciate what's beautiful. And she was always primarily concerned with people, and they were always the most beautiful things in the books. I remember I was outraged by the casting of Antonio Banderas as Armand in the Interview with the Vampire movie, because I had such an incredibly powerful image of Armand in my mind. Not that Banderas isn't a good-looking man, but he looks nothing like Armand. In the books, Armand is supposed to be Slavic, with pale, creamy skin and russet hair, and she spends probably, hundreds of pages, I would guess, describing how beautiful and pretty he is. He's supposed to look like an angel and have the face of a cherub, and he looks like Botticelli's Mercury. He's small and thin and even delicate looking, but the hot part is that he's kind of messed up in the head, and he's also one of the oldest and most dangerous vampires. He runs a vampire theater decorated with art by Bruegel and Hieronymus Bosch, and they kill humans on stage as performance art. I think he gave me a lifelong obsession with guys who are pretty but also kind of crazy and dangerous. All through high school, when I read these books and after, I was completely in love with Armand. He was my boyfriend long before I ever had an actual boyfriend. So it's not an insult to Banderas that he could never possibly replace my perfect imaginary vampire boyfriend.
And also he comes, as I later developed in the novel The Vampire Armand, he comes from this Russian background, which very much denigrates the physical, a really brutal ascetic background where you repress the physical. He comes from that monastery of the caves where people used to bury themselves halfway and just take a little bit of food every day in the hope that they would soon die, but not by their own hand. And he comes from that background. He's plunged into the Renaissance, into a completely different approach to life, an approach that celebrates the beauty of art, the beauty of the human body, the beauty of the world, and he never really quite can get it.
Armand is so beautiful in the books that he's kidnapped and sold into sexual slavery, and then the vampire Marius saves him by purchasing him from the slavers. But of course then Marius falls in love with him, and then they have a sexual relationship too. This is one of many storylines in the books that when I look at them now, I'm sure people could find problems with. There's rape and consent and slavery and so on. But that's totally beside the point. It's a fantasy. It's not instructions on how to live your actual life. It lets your mind wander through all of these imaginary scenarios and things that would be totally impossible to experience otherwise.
You've written the Sleeping Beauty trilogy.
Right.
We've just exploded into a national conversation in our country about violence against women and about that whole sexual genre of domination and submission.
Sure.
What are we to say when that very popular world of fiction crosses over into real life? And that's what's launched a conversation in this country. How do you feel about that as a woman?
Well, first off, I feel that the imagination is the place where you can explore the transgressive. It's where you can explore. In literature, that's the place where you can explore the forbidden. You can go there and you can talk about it. And in writing the Sleeping Beauty trilogy, I was trying to create a very safe place for people who enjoyed fantasies of domination and submission, where nobody really got killed, nobody was ever cut with a knife, nobody was ever really brutalized, but where you had this fairy tale kingdom where people could play games of dominance and submission. It was almost like the theme park of S&M, the Disneyland of S&M. I think it's good. I think it's good to be able to go to that safe place and explore all of these aspects of your psyche and your subconscious, and then move back out of that, back into your safe, ordinary life. There's no reason for it to bleed over. You know, we didn't come out of the movie theater in the 50s after a Western wanting to go shoot somebody, you know.
I did meet Anne a few years ago, and I thought about trying to tell her some of these feelings that I had about her books. When I met her, she was wonderful, signing several books for me, chatting with me, and posing for a picture. There was a line of people behind me to see her, but this was all within the rules of the signing, and she had assistants that would have rushed me along if I had been taking too much time. Even though at that point, Anne had been a famous author for decades and met thousands and thousands of fans, she never seemed to me anything other than excited to meet another fan and to hear what I had to say. Of course, I was too nervous to say much, and when I'd come up to her table, I hadn't really known whether she would talk with me at all. So in the end, I don't think I said anything interesting except to thank her. Afterward, I kicked myself for not thinking of something better to say. And since then, I thought many times about what I would say to her the next time I got to meet her. It didn't seem until tonight that there wouldn't be a next time. She still seemed like she had so many stories left to tell. A few years ago, she was spending time on Facebook talking to fans about what they would like to see if her vampire novels were adapted into a TV series, and she replied to one of my comments. Of course, I was commenting because I had a lot of opinions about how they should cast Armand. As the next few years stretched on and the TV show didn't materialize, and it seemed to be stuck in development hell somewhere, I thought to myself a few times that I really hoped the TV show would happen when she was still around to see it. It seemed like seeing a great adaptation of her stories was a dream of hers. That, combined with the fact that I was still greedy for more books from her, made it seem like her story just couldn't be nearly over yet. But I do think that she did know how many fans she had and how many people loved her and loved her writing, and I really hope that she knew how much she'll be remembered.
Well, we're at 3 o'clock and it's time. And was there any final thing that you would like to say to the Vampire Chronicles page about the television series, about...
I want to thank everybody, and just keep it coming, and know that you are appreciated, and that I wouldn't be who I am if it wasn't for you. And so I appreciate you guys very, very much, and I appreciate your power, and I never take you for granted. I love you, and thank you very much for tuning in.